Body System students, welcome to our lesson on the digestive system. Here's just a very brief overview of essentially the 7 steps that food follows as it passes through the digestive system. We begin with ingestion, which means putting the food into the mouth, eating it. Mastication is the chewing of the food with the teeth. Deglutition is swallowing of the food. The food moves through the digestive system, including the esophagus, stomach, and intestines. The food is digested when it is beginning in the stomach and moving into the small intestine. The digestion occurs. Absorption also occurs in the intestine, and then defecation is the act of the undigested food exiting the digestive system. Just a quick piece of vocabulary. The alimentary canal is a term used to refer to the uninterrupted tube of your digestive system that extends all the way from your mouth to the end at the anus. And so this can be many feet long. So you're essentially like a very weirdly shaped donut. Your mouth is one end of the alimentary canal, and the anus is the other end of the alimentary canal. Now let's discuss the path that food follows as it goes through the digestive system. Of course, it begins in the oral cavity or the mouth. This is where the tongue and teeth move together to mash the food through the process of mastication. You mash the food up with your teeth, and the purpose of this is to increase the surface area of the food so that your digestive enzymes later on will be able to access more of it. And then the tongue moves around in the mouth, and if you pay attention to what your tongue is doing in your mouth when you're chewing, it's wiggling around a lot and it's forming the food in your mouth into kind of a cohesive ball called a bolus. And this is the ball that you swallow. If you tried to swallow a bunch of little chunks of stuff, and it would be more likely that you would choke on something. So your tongue works to form the chewed up food into a bolus that you can swallow easily. Next, we have the pharynx. This is like the uppermost portion of the esophagus. It's like the part of the throat that's leading down to the esophagus, where it splits. Like your throat is one tube until it gets to the bottom of the pharynx, and then it splits into esophagus and trachea, essentially. So there's a little flap called the epiglottis, and this, every time you swallow, this shuts down over the top of your trachea or your windpipe that travels to your lungs, so that when you swallow, you don't aspirate or get food or water into your lungs. Next, the food moves into the rest of the esophagus. This is basically just a tube that's leading from the pharynx, just behind the mouth, to the stomach. There are sphincter muscles, which are circular muscles that can expand and contract to allow food to move through them. So the upper esophageal sphincter, this is at the top of your throat, and this is a sphincter that controls your deglutition or your swallowing. So this is a voluntary sphincter. You have voluntary control over this. You can cause yourself to swallow on purpose. Now, the lower esophageal sphincter is at the bottom of the esophagus down here. So upper esophageal sphincters up here, lower esophageal sphincters down here, where the esophagus is connecting to the stomach. And this is what allows the food to enter the stomach from the esophagus. And then once the food has passed through, that sphincter muscle is supposed to close so that the food and stomach acid don't reflux back up into the esophagus. This is an involuntary sphincter muscle. You do not have control over this sphincter muscle. So again, reflux occurs when the sphincter muscle doesn't keep everything in the stomach where it should be, and like if it's malfunctioning, it can not maybe close all the way or be weak and let food and stomach acid reflux up into the esophagus. Chronic reflux is called GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, and this is like chronic heartburn because you have something that's wrong with the sphincter muscle or something that's wrong with your stomach, and so the food and acid is able to reflux up into the esophagus consistently, and this is not good because that can eventually cause esophageal cancer. The way that food moves down the esophagus is through this process of peristalsis. Peristalsis is a really important process in the body. This is basically the contraction of smooth muscles to move stuff through an organ. So you can see in this little animation right here, it's kind of like bands of muscle within the tube of the esophagus will squeeze and push the food downward. And of course, this is also aided by gravity. Next, the food enters the stomach. So this is basically just a mucus-lined pouch that is linking the esophagus and the small intestine. So this is where like the first major part of digestion occurs. There are a little bit of digestive enzymes that are found in your saliva that can start breaking down a little bit of carbohydrate, but the stomach is where the main digestion process begins. So the stomach, the inside of the stomach is coated in these folds or ridges called rugae, and so these are basically so that the stomach can expand and contract. So when the stomach is contracted, these rugae are all squinched up like this, and when the stomach expands after you've eaten a large meal, they will kind of flatten out. There is a sphincter at the bottom of the stomach, so the lower esophageal sphincter is up here that allows food to go into the stomach from the esophagus. The food will hang out in the stomach for a while. The stomach has these bands of muscle that are going in different orientations, and this is so that the stomach can churn. So your stomach is actually like constantly kind of squeezing the food in there to get it all mixed up with all the digestive juices and stomach acid that are within this pouch. And then this pyloric sphincter is at the bottom of the stomach, and this is what allows food to move from the stomach into the duodenum, which you're going to learn in a second. That's just the first portion of the small intestine. So the stomach is like very full of mucus for the reason that it is full of acid. The reason that it has acid is because there is a digestive enzyme called pepsin that works really well at a low pH, and that's found within the stomach. And so the stomach has all of this mucus to protect its own endothelium from being damaged by the acid within the stomach. After exiting the stomach, the food moves into the small intestine, so it's kind of a liquidy, mushy type of material at this point. The small intestine is a large, smooth muscle tube. It's about 22 feet long in an adult. This is the longest portion of the entire alimentary canal. The reason it's called small is because it's smaller in diameter than the large intestine or the colon, not because it's shorter. The colon is much shorter in length than the small intestine. So the small intestine is very important because 90% of all of the chemical digestion of food occurs in the small intestine, as well as absorption of the nutrients that are digested out of that food. The reason that the small intestine is so long is because it allows for increased contact time with digesting food. So the longer the food is inside of the alimentary canal, the more chance the digestive enzymes have to get at it and break it apart so that it can be absorbed by the small intestine. There are three divisions of the small intestine. First is the duodenum. This is connected to the stomach, and then the middle portion is called the jejunum, and the end portion that connects to the colon eventually is called the ileum. Food moves through the small intestine by peristalsis, just like it does through the esophagus, and by the time that food gets to the end of the small intestine, it is called chyme, which is basically a very watery goo, very liquidy, with very little nutrient left. If there's any nutrient left in it, it's just because the digestive enzymes didn't get a chance to get at it. And then this also contains any undigestible things like maybe plant fiber that you may have eaten. An important feature of the small intestine are these little structures called villi. These are little finger-like folds that are poking out of the small intestine. So the small intestine, when you're just looking at it, looking at the inside of it, it looks smooth, but it's actually coated in all of these finger-like little nubs sticking off of the surface. And then each of those villi nubs is then coated further in tons of individual little microvilli. And the purpose of this is to increase surface area for absorption, because the more surface area of these absorbing cells that there is in the small intestine, the more nutrients can be absorbed as the food passes through. So there are a lot of different disorders that can damage these villi or even destroy them. And when the villi are damaged or destroyed, you could be constantly eating lots of food, but if you can't absorb it through your villi and your microvilli, you're going to experience malnutrition. This is just a video that you can go back to later. It's showing an upper GI endoscopy, which is the process of taking a little like camera on a rope basically and shoving it through the mouth and esophagus and down into the stomach and even into the duodenum of the small intestine. Typically this is done if they're looking for something like a stomach ulcer, which is like a sore in the mucus-lined tissue of the stomach, or looking for a duodenal ulcer. They're just basically looking for anything that could be going wrong in the esophagus, stomach, or first portion of the small intestine. All right, we're getting close to the end here. Now moving on to the large intestine, which is also just called the colon. This is another muscular tube. It's about 9, maybe 10 feet long in an adult human. The main role of the large intestine or colon is to absorb water from the chyme. So this is where your hydration comes from. So the food and water that you drink passes through the stomach and small intestine, and then once it gets to the large intestine is when the water is absorbed and it turns that leftover undigestible stuff into solid feces that can be eliminated. The divisions of the large intestine, there are quite a few. First, we have the cecum. This is the very first portion of the large intestine that is connected to the ileum of the small intestine. This is where the chyme is, or the chyme is initially received. The appendix is a little finger-like nub that is sticking off of the cecum of the large intestine. Now, for a very long time, they thought that the appendix was a vestigial organ, like it had no role in the body, but in recent years we have found that the role of the appendix is as a reservoir for your gut flora. Now, all of this digestion that occurs in your gut is very strongly aided by the bacteria that live in your gut. In fact, if you did not have the gut bacteria, you would not be able to digest your food. And so your appendix is basically like a little pocket full of your specific fingerprint of gut bacteria, so that if something happens, like um, evolutionarily, if you ate something bad and got really bad diarrhea and lost your gut bacteria, or now in more modern years, if you take a course of antibiotics and that kills off your gut bacteria, you have this appendix, which is just a little pocket full of the bacteria to repopulate your gut after your bacteria has been killed off by something. So then the cecum connects to the ascending colon, which is just referring to the way that the colon is oriented on the body. So this portion is on the right side of the body. I need a diagram for this. It's on the right side of the body. So it goes up on the right side, and then the transverse colon goes across. The descending colon goes down. The sigmoid colon is the portion where the colon kind of like makes a little bit of a turn so that it can turn into the rectum, which is pointing downwards, and then the anus is just a sphincter muscle that controls defecation. This is a voluntary sphincter muscle for us adults. It's not very voluntary for little babies, but this controls the action of allowing the solid feces to exit the alimentary canal. Here it is. Here's my diagram. Okay, so you can imagine all of this in here is filled with like small intestine wiggling back and forth a bunch. And then the ileum of the small intestine connects here to the cecum. Here's the appendix, just a little nub sticking off, again, pocket full of bacteria. Now, so here's the cecum, this very first portion. Ascending colon goes up, transverse colon goes across, descending colon goes down. Sigmoid colon is this little turn where it's going to turn into the rectum, which is like the reservoir for the feces. This is the portion that has stretch receptors in it to let you know when it is time to eliminate the solid waste. And then the anus is, again, that round sphincter muscle at the bottom of the alimentary canal, at the bottom of the colon, that can allow the feces to exit. Okay, moving on to different types of digestion. There's two main categories. The first is called mechanical digestion, and this is like physically breaking up the food into smaller pieces. So this occurs in the mouth through that process of mastication or chewing. So you chomp up your food in your mouth, you chomp it into smaller bits, so that by the time it gets down into the stomach and the rest, it is easier to digest. So this is like, I don't know if you've ever eaten something that you've swallowed whole, like a common one is corn if it's not chewed well enough, or even like berries and things like that. If you swallow it whole, it is going to just move through the whole digestive tract and come out the other end, because if you don't chew it up, your digestive enzymes can't get to it and chemically digest it. The stomach also carries out some mechanical digestion. Again, those different layers of differently oriented tissue kind of squeeze the stomach and mush the food around in there through some peristalsis to just make sure that it gets broken up even more than it already was by the teeth in the mouth. Now moving on to chemical digestion. This is carried out by digestive enzymes and also kind of those gut bacteria that are within your intestine. So in the mouth, chemical digestion of carbs and some fats can occur. There is an enzyme called salivary amylase, which can start breaking down some sugars, and there is an enzyme called lingual lipase that can start breaking down fats. Lingual is just referring to the tongue. In the stomach, There can be some digestion of proteins and fats. So again, that enzyme pepsin, which is aided by hydrochloric acid, can start breaking down protein in the stomach. And then there's also an enzyme called gastric lipase. Gastric is just referring to the stomach. So this is an enzyme that can start to break down fat a little bit. In the small intestine, you can digest really most macromolecules. Proteins, there's multiple different types of digestive enzymes. There's aminopeptidase and dipeptidase. So remember, like peptide, is referring to amino acids and proteins. So that's how you can kind of remember that those enzymes go with proteins. Nucleic acids, nucleosidase and phosphatase, those can break down the nucleic acid. So like nucleo, you can think nucleic acid, and then phosphatase, you can just remember that nucleic acids like DNA and RNA have a phosphate like backbone kind of deal going on in their molecules. So you can remember that phosphatase digests nucleic acids for that reason. And then for carbohydrates, lactase is an enzyme that can digest milk sugar, lactose. Maltase is an enzyme that can digest another type of sugar called maltose. And then sucrase is an enzyme that can digest sucrose, which is like what you find in table sugar. Okay, so now the pancreas. We know the role of the pancreas as an endocrine organ, which controls the blood glucose levels, but the pancreas also plays a very strong role in producing digestive enzymes, and then there are little ducts leading from the pancreas into the small intestine to put those digestive enzymes into there. So the endocrine function of the pancreas is to control blood sugar, and the exocrine function of the pancreas is to send enzymes through tubes into the small intestine. So anyway, proteins can be digested by pancreatic enzymes. Carboxypeptidase, again, the peptid in here is in the name. Chymotrypsin, elastase, and trypsin, these are all a bunch of different enzymes that can digest proteins. Nucleic acids, we have deoxyribonuclease and ribonucleose. Those are easy to remember because deoxyribonucleic acid is DNA and ribonucleic acid is RNA. For carbs, the pancreas can help digest carbs through the secretion of pancreatic amylase. Again, amylase just digests a type of carbohydrate called amylose. And then pancreatic lipase is also produced, and that can help to digest fats. The liver helps as a digestive organ because it produces a substance called bile, and the function of bile is to break up globules of fat, because you know if you've ever like put some oil into water or whatever, if you were to shake it up, the fat would kind of clump into spheres. And so bile can break up those fat globules or spheres so that they are smaller so that lipase can get at them better. And then the gallbladder is just a little pouch kind of underneath the liver that will store bile produced by the liver. And then as it sees the need, as it sees fat in the small intestine, it will let little squirts of that bile into the small intestine to help to digest the fat. Organs are considered primary or accessory organs of the digestive system, and all this has to do with is whether or not the food actually touches the organ. So the primary organs are the ones that food passes through. So the esophagus, food goes through the esophagus, it goes through the stomach, it goes through the small intestine, and it goes through the large intestine. An organ that plays a role in digestion but doesn't actually have any food that ever touches it is considered to be accessory. So this is the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, and also the salivary glands. These are all things that secrete digestive juices, but food never actually touches them. All right, into the final portion of this presentation. We're going to talk about a couple disorders, common disorders of the digestive system. So we talked about GERD a little bit. This is gastroesophageal reflux disease. So this is just like chronic reflux of stomach acid into the stomach acid and food into the esophagus through a weakened lower esophageal sphincter. Ulcers are open sores that can occur in the lining of the digestive tract. They're common in the stomach because of the acid. When you get a little like sore and ulcer in your stomach, the acid can really irritate it. Gallstones are when you have bile that is in your gallbladder that kind of solidifies. There are some substances in the bile that can kind of crystallize. So if you think kind of like a kidney stone is a crystallized thing, it's very similar. You can get stones that form in your gallbladder too. Celiac disease is an autoimmune condition in which gluten, which is a protein found in some different grains, especially in like wheat, can irritate the villi of the small intestine, and it causes the body to attack those villi and destroy them, which of course is very bad because if your villi are destroyed, you cannot absorb nutrients from other foods. Crohn's disease is an inflammatory bowel disorder which can affect any portion of the digestive tract, and it's essentially just like that portion of the digestive tract that is affected is just not going to do its job, and it's just going to push the food, partially digested or otherwise, it's just going to push it straight through that portion, so it doesn't have enough time to actually absorb nutrients out of it. Ulcerative colitis is another inflammatory bowel disorder, and this typically is only going to affect the colon. So this is when your body sees food particles, particularly proteins on different types of foods. It sees them, it doesn't know what they are, and so it thinks they're foreign invaders or pathogens, and then it attacks those food particles, and in the process of doing that, it can form ulcers within the colon. Irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, is a really wide range of problems of the digestive system. This is basically identified if you have diarrhea or constipation 3 times a month, you're considered to have IBS. And so there's like something going on that's irritating your digestive system. Hemorrhoids are little inflammations of pockets of blood vessels that are in the rectum or anus, and so they just kind of swell up and they can be painful. Diverticulitis is when you have little pouches in the intestine. So like if you have a weak spot in the smooth muscle that makes up the wall of your intestine, it will kind of pouch out a little bit. And if food gets caught in there along with the bacteria that are in your gut, it can kind of fester and get weird and cause an infection. And then finally, we have colon polyps. These are just growths of colon tissue that can sometimes lead to cancer. The main thing that they say to do to avoid getting colon polyps is to include plenty of fiber in your diet to make sure that food is not allowed to linger within the colon for too long, because there's the belief that food spending too much time in the digestive tract can cause issues such as polyp growth.